Chapter 10 The Book of Kin, A Family Chronicle. In 2002, Delia Publishers issued the next book of the Ringing Cedars series entitled Rodovaya Kniga, The Book of Kin, in which it advised its readers, "Our publishing house has taken the idea of a book of kin to heart. As we were getting this book ready for press, we decided to set at once about publishing a blank book of kin for you to fill in and thereby keep a record of your own family chronicle." Not long after the Delia published this family chronicle in 2003, the Ruskia Dom publishing house put out a book under the title Semenia Letopis, a family chronicle. One of its compilers was Archimandrite Tikhon Shevkonov. At the front of the book were featured guest forwards by the Russian President Vladimir Putin and Alexei II, Patriarch of Moscow and of all the Russians. A family chronicle is not just a simple story about a few human destinies, or even about a whole family. It tells the story of a whole nation. The destiny of Russia is the history of families over successive generations. Such knowledge is indispensable for each citizen of Russia to become aware of his roots and his role in the history of our great motherland. Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, President of Russia. The atmosphere of the family and home, relations with one's relations, memories of one's forebears, and the raising of one's descendants. All this has tremendous implications for the moral strengthening of the individual and, consequently, of the nation. It is no coincidence that it is said among many different peoples that love for one's motherland begins at home. Alexei II, Patriarch of Moscow and of all the Russias. The first one to put forward this idea was Anastasia. Just a few days will go by, and millions of fathers and mothers in many lands will be writing their book of kin, filling in its pages with their own hand. There will be a vast multitude of them, these books of kin, and all of them will contain the truths which begin in the heart for their children. There will be no room in these books for artifice or guise. Before them, all the lies of history will fall. Anastasia. We shan't go into details as to how Ruski Dom followed the example of Delia, or who was responsible. The important thing is the implementation of the idea itself. Now we can see that this idea has the support of the President, the Patriarch, and the Chairman of the State Duma, who presented copies of a family chronicle to school children on Knowledge Day. Now, what are the poor slanderers to do? Include the President, the Patriarch, and the Chairman of the State Duma in their list of sectarians, along with the former President of Ukraine, who signed a decree regarding family farms, granting Ukrainians not 1 but 2 hectares of land each. And we must not forget Governor Ayatskov, who during an interview on NTV said of Anastasia's followers, "The future of the country lies with them." He has also encouraged his civil service staff to acquire land and set up their own family domains. Nor Governor Tuliv or the Kemerovo region, who has granted land for settlement, nor the Supreme Mufti of Russia, Talgat Tajuddin, who responded to a question by a Sotvorine Studios correspondent as to what he thought of the Ringing Cedars series, as follows. "I love these books. I read them and get a great deal out of them. I feel that reading these books helps strengthen man's faith in God. After all, we need to nourish our faith in God day by day. But for that, it is not only our eyes that must be open, more importantly, our heart must be open. Besides, our heart has been given to us for to love." And Vladimir Nikolaevich Migre's books help us love God. He conveys this truth to people through the words of Anastasia. Perhaps theologians may have some reservations. Perhaps someone will call it just a hypothesis, But faith in God, and especially love for God, is something that starts growing bit by bit, and afterward becomes immeasurable. And long before we get to the next world, right here in this world, man can become happy. And the Ringing Cedars series helps us do this. On the eve of these events, evidently under pressure of the machinations and fear-mongering of these same anti-sectarians, one Orthodox archbishop, I shall not give his name so as not to immortalize him, signed a letter threatening to excommunicate from the church anyone who reads or distributes the Ringing Cedars books. This would mean that the archbishop would excommunicate the patriarch himself, who has supported the idea in creating a family chronicle containing his and the president's signed forewords. Even if the patriarch has never even held any of my books in his hands, that's not the point. It's not the paper with the printed text of the books, after all, that's important, but the ideas set forth in them. Now that one of the ideas has been approved, I am convinced that it won't be long before others will be granted official state support. But in the meantime, so perhaps it is time we drew the attention of our law enforcement agencies to just who these so-called anti-sectarians really are. By what methods or machinations do they operate, hiding so conveniently beneath the vaulted ceilings of Russia's Orthodox Church? Evidently, they are not there for prayers, the fomenting of interreligious discord, the discrediting of government agencies. That's what they're really up to. And it would be foolish to even suppose that some group of anti-sectarians is that strongly concerned about my personal spiritual development. Their actions, rather, are testimony to their carrying out orders to stop any positive transformations from taking place in Russia. An illustration of their ideologically based diversionary tactics may be seen in the following example as well. The Jewish question. Recently, for the umpteenth time already over the past millennium, passions have been inflamed over the Jewish question. There has been more and more talk about the spread in both Europe and Russia of extremist views, including anti-Semitism. The European Jewish Congress has linked this situation with the growth of Muslim populations in Europe countries, which are, as they say, aggressively anti-Jewish. But there are many concrete historical examples testifying to the fact that aggressions can be deliberately provoked, and this is now actively being pursued by certain circles. The provokers may even come from the ranks of the Jews themselves. One has the impression that some kind of order has been received regarding the organization of pogroms. Jewish pogroms are very profitable to someone, and I'm talking about financial profit. Extremist organizations do not derive any financial benefit from pogroms. Rather, they suffer losses. But these pogroms offer a palpable benefit to countries where Jewish members of the financial oligarchy flee to legalize their multi-billion-dollar incomes and obtain international immunity from prosecution. And for the sake of such financial benefit, they are ready to subject to abuse ordinary and utterly harmless Jews living on Russian territory. This has happened over and over again in the annals of the long-suffering Jewish people. What's the point of a pogrom? The logic is simple. Public opinion is turning against the oligarchs, the financial magnates, as never before. According to government statistics, approximately 70% of Russia's population believe that they should be immediately censored and dispossessed. Acting on the basis of law, the president, the government of the Russian prosecutor's office are attempting to investigate the activity of a number of oligarchs. They have declared war on corruption, and it appears as though over the next 4 years the oligarchs may indeed be obliged to forfeit their financial holdings. Given the situation, they are naturally trying to get out of the country. But then there is the problem of how to legalize their transfer of capital to the West. The surest way is to provoke a kind of pogrom that will shock the world community. It is easy to see what happens next. The financial magnates simply turn up in one of the Western countries while these pogroms are going on and declare themselves political refugees. Naturally, this provides them with not only political asylum, but also legalization of their financial holdings, even while they may still maintain at least partial control over resources and factories back home, through dummy CEOs or trusted associates. And herein lies an important message for all Russian citizens, especially those organizations which call themselves patriotic. Don't ever give in to provocation or stoop to the level of organizing pogroms against synagogues. You will only be acting out somebody else's script. It would be wrong to accuse all Jews of machinations and unseemly acts. Just like Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians, Jews come in all stripes and colors. I offer the following as proof. I was once the featured speaker at a readers' conference in Kazan, where the audience was comprised of different nationalities, including many Muslims. During my remarks, I read a chapter from a book by the Jewish writer and poet Efim Kushner entitled Bezkrovnya Revolucja, A Bloodless Revolution. Before reading it, I said that this was a Jewish writer living in Israel, but writing about Russia, about her future. When I had finished reading the chapter, the hall broke into thunderous applause. Muslims, too, applauded this Jewish writer and poet. Why? How did it happen that supposedly aggressive Muslims offered their sincere applause to a Jewish writer? It happened because in this book he speaks about the marvelous future of Russia, linking it to the ideas outlined in the Ringing Cedars series. He calls upon the Russian government to adopt a program based on these ideas. I can tell you right off that he is not the only Jew who accepts and supports Anastasia's concepts set forth in the books. In Israel, there is a whole club of readers who have been drawn to the books about the Siberian recluse. Israelis are composing songs in both Russian and Hebrew about the characters in the series. I have the distinct impression that in the final analysis, it will be the Jews who take the lead in putting the ideas into practice, and will draw peoples of many lands along in their wake. I can at least tell you that I have been informed that right there in Israel significant funds have been set aside for the construction of environmentally clean settlements. Oh, those connivers, people will say later on. See, they're stealing the Russian idea out from under us. Pardon me, but they are not stealing anything from us. In fact, they are saving this idea. Will you kindly tell me who is preventing the Russian authorities from implementing the ideas in the books? After all, for the past 5 years, practically, it is these same authorities that have been targeted with a large number of individual and collective letters by Russians living in the Commonwealth of independent states and elsewhere in the world. It is truly a comical situation that has developed. A host of researchers keep talking about the birth of a national idea among the Russian people. But the way things are turning out here, it looks as though it will have its first implementation in Israel. Who is to blame? Overall, every discussion on the Jewish question so far, at least those in publications I have access to, seems pretty primitive. Almost all of them boil down to a routine statement of the facts. Jews have taken over the press in various countries. Pretty much all the TV networks are in Jewish hands. Most cash flow is controlled by Jews. But all this is no doubt true, including here in Russia today. But this is simply a statement of fact and nothing more. It is far more important to explain why situations like this have developed in various countries, with an enviable consistency over a period of centuries. I can tell you the following right off. It is simply that the Jews are obliged to do this, and we are obliged to fall into line with them, including on the legislative level. Judge for yourselves. The State Duma of the Russian Federation adopted a law recognizing 4 basic religions, 2 of which are Christianity and Judaism. According to Christianity, the Christian is the slave of God. Wealth is not welcomed. In St. Petersburg, where I am writing these lines, I can see from my hotel window the huge Orthodox Cathedral of the Blessed Virgin of Vladimir, on the facade of which is written in large gold lettering, "Hear, Our Lady, the prayer of thy slave." According to Judaism, the Jew is the chosen one of God. To him belong wealth and lands, and usury is welcomed. Everybody knows what a huge influence religious exercise on man's mentality, character development, and way of life. So let us be consistent in the logic of our actions. The highest legislative organ of our land has accepted these two concepts, at the same time designating who is to be slave and who is to be ruler. And being the law-abiding citizens that we are, let us not keep deceiving each other, but let us accept as a given, according to the law adopted by our government, that the Jews have authority over us. Now, there are some that will not be satisfied with such a position. Some will even consider such a statement absurd. But let us not close our eyes to the actualities of life. Let us see clearly the causes of what is going on, or we shall keep on tasting the consequences with an unyielding regularity. If someone is unhappy over the current situation, then by all means let us work together and find an alternative. The solution might be an idea acceptable with equal enthusiasm to Muslims, Christians, Jews, and members of other faiths. Such an idea exists. Not only will it fix the situation, but it holds the future in its hands. There are specific facts and life situations that attest to this. Let's create. In an address to the Federal Assembly, the President of the Russian Federation set a goal of doubling the country's gross domestic product within 10 years. Well, a goal is a goal, and measures must be taken to reach it. The first step is to inspire the people with a vision. It is the people, after all, who must work to double the GDP indicators. And what has been happening since this goal was set by the highest officials in the current government? Incredible events began to take place. Instead of at least making an attempt at realizing the goal, some highly placed officials began talking about how unfeasible its implementation was, while others insisted it still must be attained. And that's it, nothing more. These discussions have wasted precious time. And the year 2004 ended miserably with a GDP growth of a mere 6.4%. Right from the start, this fascinating subtext as to whether the goal was feasible or not ran throughout the whole treatment of the subject by the press, but again with not even a single attempt at implementation. This situation points to the fact that Russian authorities are heading for a state of utter helplessness, and it makes no difference here whether the officials in question are elected or unelected. They will find any excuse they can not to carry out the directive. Imagine how it would be if a commander-in-chief gave the order to prepare to attack, and his generals and colonels, instead of working out a plan of attack, began to discuss whether an attack was feasible or not. In that case, defeat would be an inevitability, which is exactly what happened. But could it be possible that the goal set by the president was really preposterous? We can't judge until we try to figure it out for ourselves. However, I will jump ahead of myself and say it is feasible. I can just see my reader's dumbfounded reaction. What's all this about Russian Orthodox Church, anti-sectarians, Western intelligence services, and the goal set by the president for doubling Russia's GDP? Be patient. There is a very close mutual connection here. Think who would benefit by a doubling of Russia's GDP? Russia herself, of course. Who would lose by it? Naturally, the West, which looks upon Russia merely as an overflow market for its substandard merchandise. And Western intelligence services, it seems, have once again had the upper hand as usual, putting down the Russian president and his officials, ridiculing them even as the aforementioned goal was being set. But let's go step by step. In order to double the overall GDP, it is necessary to first identify those economic sectors where an increase in output is essential, as well as those where such an increase would be undesirable. The production of tobacco, wine, and spirits, for example. Russia's already drowning in her own booze and choking on her own tobacco smoke. You wouldn't want to double the output of armaments or build new casinos or double the outflow of raw materials from this country, which means that the remaining sectors of the economy are faced with the task of not just doubling but tripling or even quadrupling their output. These sectors have not yet been identified, and consequently no specific goal has been suggested to them. Well, some may object, if we're not sure we can double our GDP or not, how can we even think in terms of quadrupling? An impossible task. But I say it is possible. It is possible, and not only that, but it requires no additional capital investment. Take agriculture, for example, where production has been cutting back year after year to the point where it has already begun to threaten national security. It is the talk of politicians, Duma deputies, and a number of government officials, but they're not talking in the wind. In the case of some food categories, imports already account for up to 40% of the market. This is already a threat to our national security. And what awaits us after that? I'll tell you. By 2005, our country's rural population is expected to shrink by 25%, which will exacerbate the problem even further. More specifically, it will make the country completely dependent on external sources. And then the government will be forced to pay for food not just with natural resources, but through sales of missiles, just to avoid being utterly torn to pieces by the population at large. This means a sea change is required in the whole agriculture industry. It must double or even triple its production. However, this will never happen using traditional methods, where all proposals simply come down to nothing more than a requirement for additional subsidies. And it is not clear just who these subsidies are to be directed to, given that the able-bodied rural population keeps significantly decreasing in numbers. And if that be the case, not even the most state-of-the-art equipment or super technology is going to help. There will simply be nobody left to work with it, which means that our goal is first and foremost to have able-bodied people showing up in the countryside. Millions of them, tens of millions, not only that, but they must be people with a desire to reach out and touch the ground with love. If they don't show up, there's no point in talking about anything else. To hear some officials tell it, however, getting people to show up like that would be nothing short of a miracle. It is not something they believe in. They haven't believed in it, even when it's happened. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, the miracle has happened, and thanks to one individual, the Siberian recluse named Anastasia. Maybe her words seem incredible and fantastical to some, but they are right on. They have given birth to an enduring impulsion in people's hearts and souls. Tens of thousands of people in various parts of the country have been wanting to chart their life course in a rural setting, to set up their domains there and move in. The numbers of applicants are rising with each passing year. They are setting up their own regional action groups and demanding us, give us land. We are ready to take care of it. These people have united in a non-governmental organization, which was founded at a conference in the city of Vladimir on the 5th of June 2004. An event which showed for the first time in post-Soviet Russia the rise of a popular force unparalleled in modern times. The hall was filled to capacity as many came who were not registered delegates but simply wanted to listen and tune in to what was happening. By a vote taken at the conference, a people's movement was set up under the name Ringing Cedars of Russia, with the basic aim of supporting the idea of kin's domains. It was truly a people's movement, opposed to neither the government nor any political party. Rather, it aimed to reach out to all with the simplest message, let's create. Thus, a people movement was born with a clear and distinct program, easily comprehensible to and solidly supported by the public. What benefit would accrue to the state of Russia by carrying out just one platform of this program? Outwardly, it is a very simple platform, focusing on a single hectare of land, but envisaging the following wide-ranging results. A significant improvement in the environmental situation. Restoration of soil fertility. A solution to the question of providing high-quality produce for the country's population. A significant twofold or threefold increase in wages across all sectors of the economy without risk of inflation. An immediate improvement in the demographic situation and in the general health of the population, including its rejuvenation. A solution to the question of the nation's defense preparedness. The termination of capital outflow along with, by contrast, a capital inflow into Russia, the return of her intellectual resources. A significant reduction in, over the next few years, an eventual extirpation of bribery, corruption, gangsterism, and terrorism. A coming together of neighboring countries, along with those of the former Warsaw Pact, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the 3 Baltic states, into a single powerful union. Cessation of the arms race and close cooperation among Russia, the U.S., and Eastern Muslim states. These points have been worked out not just by me, but also by a number of students in their graduating essays, e.g. the essay by the budding jurist Tatiana Borodina. They are also talked about in scholarly publications, e.g. by the Professor Viktor Yakovlevich Medikov, a 3-term deputy of the Legislative Assembly who holds a doctorate in economics. There are a number of privately published brochures on the topic, written by professional researchers as well as ordinary people. I shall attempt to jot down a few words of explanation and justification of some of these points. So, let us suppose that our country has decided to implement the program proposed by Anastasia. Every willing family is offered free of charge 1 hectare of land for lifetime use with the right of inheritance for the purposes of establishing on it their own kin's domain. The produce grown on the domain, as well as the domain itself, is not subject to any form of taxation. The adoption of this program will lead to the following results. A significant improvement in the environmental situation. Practice has shown that people who have received land for a kin's domain first of all set about planting wild growing trees, at an average of up to 200 trees per family, along with an average of 2,000 shrubs, hedges, and berry bushes, and 50 fruit-bearing trees. Even using the most conservative estimates, researchers predict that the adoption of such a program on a national level, if correctly implemented, will lead, right in its earliest stages, to about 10 million Russian families setting up their own kin's domain. This means that even if the first year or two of following the adoption of the program, and without any additional subsidies, 2 billion wild-growing trees will have been planted, 20 billion shrubs, and approximately 500 million fruit-bearing trees, and that is just the beginning. Restoration of soil fertility. As can be seen from practice, the first thing people do when they are granted land, not on a short-term lease but for their lifetime use, is to put their efforts into soil restoration. Not only that, but they are doing this not just by the application of organic fertilizers, but also by a more natural method, namely the sowing of soil-building crops during the early years. A solution to the question of providing high-quality produce for the country's population. You may remember the struggle for the harvest back in the Soviet times, how school children, students, and industrial employees were transported out to collective and state-owned farms to help bring in the harvest. I myself took part in these large-scale operations, weeding fields and gathering onions at a suburban state-owned farm. However, there was still no abundance of high-quality produce in the country. Today's older generations, of course, remember how the potatoes sold in stores would be half-rotted, not to mention the most undesirable-looking vegetables. Then came the dacha movement. They began to allot people 600 square meters of land, and a miracle happened. Everyone is aware of the statistics. Ordinary people, all by themselves without any support from government ministries or agencies, have provided 80% of the vegetables produced in Russia. Unfortunately, all sorts of complications are being introduced these days, including higher travel fares, taxes on land plots, increased electricity rates, and all this on just 600 square meters, where it is impossible to create any kind of economically viable enterprise, or to plant tall trees which enrich the soil, or to put in water ponds, and so forth. And all this carried out by people without sufficient knowledge or experience, working just on weekends and holidays. A hectare of land will allow setting up of a more economically viable enterprise. With the right kind of organization, there will be a 30-fold decrease in the workload per square meter. Not all at once, mind you, but I do emphasize it has to be set up properly. That given, both existing practice and theoretical calculations confirm that implementing the proposed program will fully guarantee the country a sufficient food supply for all its citizens, bar none. Now, a word about quality. It goes without saying that someone growing agricultural produce to be used by his own family will not add any poisonous chemicals or chemical fertilizers to the soil. He will not grow any mutant produce. All this crap is being imported into our country and bought up by the public for no reason other than insufficient production here at home. Once a sufficient quality level is reached, quality becomes the number one concern. I hope I've made myself clear. A significant twofold or threefold increase in wages across all sectors of the economy without risk of inflation and a reduction of prices within the country on all forms of merchandise, leading to a reduction in social tension. Someone may wonder what possible link there could be between the implementation of the Kins Domains programs and a wage increase. Let's say for a salesman, a trolley bus driver, a nurse, or a teacher. But there is, and a direct causal link at that. Think about it. Most enterprises today are in private hands. People we call oligarchs enjoy fabulous profits, but at whose expense? Basically at the expense of minimum wage earners. And what's the point of increasing their wages, let's say, from 5,000 to 20,000 rubles a month, when there are still people queuing up just to get a job? There's simply nowhere for them to go. It's an entirely different situation with a family whose work on their own domain earns them an average of 10,000 rubles per month, which has been proved entirely feasible in practice, with a minimal cost of living. No utility bills or daily commuting expenses or the cost of buying meals at city cafes. To attract domain dwellers to work in a factory or other private enterprise, one would have to offer them a salary at least 1.5 or 2 times the income they would earn from working on the domain, and cover travel and meal expenses besides. Today, an oligarch who has privatized a factory or oil drilling company can afford to live in a castle in London. That really happens, and earn up to $1 million a month, while the workers slaving away to provide that income for him receive less than 0.1% of what he makes. This scenario can be played out ad infinitum. Inevitably, it leads to revolution, stripping the property owner of his enterprises and the overthrow of the government permitting such inequities. The only way to prevent such a result from occurring is to reach an equitable sharing arrangement with the workers. Oligarchs will not come to this point voluntarily, but, under pressure of circumstances, will give in. We mentioned the relationship between a domain dweller and the owner of an industrial enterprise, but those left living in city flats will also see their wages rise to keep them at their jobs. They too, after all, are given a choice: stay working and living in urban conditions, or start building themselves a whole new way of life in the country. And one more question on this point. Why will this not lead to inflation or price rises? Inflation is always the outcome of certain concrete procedures, specially engineered. Price rises are simply a byproduct. The cause is always man's estrangement from a natural way of life. It's an easy matter to increase prices on fuel and foodstuffs when people don't have any of either to call their own. meaning that they are completely dependent on external suppliers. But try raising apple prices for someone who has his own orchard. Absurd. And what about fuel? But even there's a limit. Today's fuel prices are so high that it is actually more profitable to till a couple of hectares of land using horses, which, by the way, supply a first-class fertilizer for the soil. An immediate improvement in the demographic situation and in the general health of the population, including its rejuvenation. It is no secret that the current demographics in our country are catastrophic, and even this word isn't strong enough to describe it fully. If a country's peacetime population decreases by almost 1 million souls annually, that is monstrous. The leader of such a country, I should think, would want to hide their identity from the public, as well as from their descendants. Discussions on the need to change the current situation amount to nothing more than pathetic babble. They don't change anything, not even increasing financial support for birthing mothers, as necessary as that may be, will lead to any substantial improvement. The history of many millennia shows that women cease giving birth when they see no prospective future for their children. It is necessary first to determine clearly and precisely the future development of society as a whole, as well as each family making up that society. The Anastasia Foundation in Vladimir conducted a survey of families planning on setting up their own kin's domains. Of the more than 2,000 polled, 1,995 responded that they would be having children. Some wanted 3 or even more. Those who for health reasons were unable to have children of their own were planning to adopt them from orphanages. How to explain this phenomenon? It is simply that a man who has built a marvelous living oasis is aware that he is building something lasting and wants his children to enjoy life too. As to rejuvenation and revitalization of health, let us turn once more to practice. Look at how much livelier and younger your grandfathers and grandmothers behave once they get out to their dachas in the springtime. And it goes without saying that a pregnant woman who eats only environmentally clean produce, drinks clean water, and breathes clean air cannot help but bear healthy children, significantly healthier than today's examples. A solution to the question of the nation's defense preparedness, a significant reduction in weapons, and over the next few years, the eventual complete extirpation of bribery, corruption, gangsterism, and terrorism. The military preparedness and morale of our armed forces today, including the nation's law enforcement officers, has slipped below the zero mark and is heading deep into the minus side. It is no secret how challenging it is for local conscription offices to call up young recruits to military services. Refusal of military obligation is no longer considered shameful among today's youth. On the contrary, it has become a mark of bravery. Those whose families are slightly better off attempt to buy their way out of serving. Those not so well off try to cut out any way they can, even to the point of self-mutilation. So it turns out that by hook or by crook, the army drags in conscripts from the poorest segments of the population. Such an army is in no position to defend anyone or anything against a major enemy. Not only that, but it is potentially dangerous to the very country it is supposed to serve. Let's take a close look at just whom the soldiers of the Russian army are called upon to protect. The motherland comes the standard response, but today the concept of motherland has been seriously eroded, and it is a challenge to grasp hold of just what is one's motherland. It wasn't that long ago that Russian officers and soldiers swore an oath of allegiance to the USSR, which was also considered their motherland. Then, all at once, the borders changed and whole parts of the territory they were defending turned out to be foreign soil. The troops deployed in these parts were suddenly treated as invaders. They were left to defend the people on the part of the territory that was still known as Russia. But what kind of people were they really protecting? Oligarchs and bribe-taking government officials? Their own families? But if a soldier or an officer came from a poor family, who was he supposed to protect them from? For the past 10 years now, government propaganda has proclaimed that we are building a civilized, democratic state on the Western model. But just think, how could today's Russian soldiers do battle against the forces of NATO or the USA if they have already been brainwashed into thinking that their enemy is civilized and developed, which must mean that we, by contrast, are uncivilized and undeveloped? Quite absurd. Is this some sort of psychobabble or deliberately invented tactic? An all-professional army has been touted as a panacea for getting out of this manufactured dead-end situation. But that is even more absurd. A professional army, as is known, is made up of mercenaries who take up arms for money and shoot at whoever they are told is the target. They carry out the orders of whoever pays the most. History is full of examples of governments afraid to bring their armies of mercenaries home. That's how it was in ancient Rome, and a similar danger exists in the USA. It is already happening in parts of Russia as well. A professional army must be kept busy in continual fighting, preferably not on the territory of the nation it is supposed to be serving. When an army returns to its home country, it will inevitably be in demand by forces opposed to the existing authority, or it will disintegrate into a large number of splinter groups, some of which may even be transformed into criminal gangs. For the most part, there is no such thing as unemployed armed mercenaries. If they are not given work, they will find it on their own and in their chosen profession. Besides, an army consisting of people serving only for money can be very easily bought off by a higher bidder. Just imagine a foreign military base located, say, in Georgia, Turkmenistan, or Ukraine, whose soldiers are paid $3,000 a month, while ours get only $500 a month. In fact, you don't need to imagine this. There are already concrete examples right here in Russia. Just look at how many highly qualified and professionally trained officers of the former KGB are now working as security guards for commercial organizations, including foreign banks. So what's the solution? There is just one and only one. We must make sure that our Russian soldiers, officers, and generals have something left to protect. Every Russian army or law enforcement officer, upon receiving the rank of lieutenant, is to be awarded not only a little star, but at the same time the right to receive a hectare of land on which to set up his kin's domain. The land grant shouldn't be for backlot wastelands, but for elite lands specially allocated by the government for settlement purposes. An officer should be able to choose his own particular hectare within these territories, and when home on leave, he should be free to plant, either alone or together with his parents, a new garden, or dig a pond, or designate a spot on which to build a house. And if he is frequently reposted to various parts of the country, or even abroad, during the time he is billeted in officers' quarters, barracks, or a field tent, every officer of the Russian army should be able to rest secure in the knowledge that back there, in a spot of his own choosing, the garden of his little motherland, his own garden, is flourishing in the springtime. And the girl who has fallen in love with him will know from the little star that her beloved has a future, has a motherland, and a family nest for their future children. And even if, for the time being, she has to share with her beloved in the challenging conditions of an officer's life, all the same, at least once a year they will visit their little motherland and share their dreams and plans for the future domain. They will decide where the pond is to be dug and where the house is to be built. And even if they are obliged to spend their month's leave on their own land in a tent, still they will be able to experience an incomparable sense of joy at beholding the marvelous future that lies ahead for the generations of their family to come. And even if the little trees of their future garden are still young and the green hedge they have planted around their domain is scarcely noticeable, these are still there, and they will grow and flourish, waiting for them, their creators. If an officer's wife becomes pregnant, within 3 months' time, the state should build on the designated spot a modest home according to the plans selected by the parents-to-be, with all the amenities afforded by modern technology. And the wife of a Russian officer will be able to spend the remaining months of her pregnancy in her own little house. Perhaps her home will be shared by her parents, or perhaps she will be alone there, keeping in touch with friendly neighbors. But most importantly, she will be surrounded and filled by the positive emotions she so badly needs. After all, she will be completely surrounded by the space of her little motherland, belonging jointly to her and her beloved. And she won't go off to have her baby overseas, or even in one of those incubators we are accustomed to calling, for some reason, maternity homes. The officer's wife will have her baby in her own domain, as many women are already doing. Possibly it will be under a doctor's supervision, but it will be at home in a familiar, favorable, and sympathetic surroundings, not in some maternity chair which has heard the moans and cries of hundreds of birthing mothers. The child of a Russian officer should be born only in his own family domain. Even if at the moment of birth the young lieutenant is somewhere far away, he will most certainly hear his child's first joyful cry, and he will let no foe encroach upon his grand motherland. He, this young lieutenant, a Russian officer, will not let a foe get past him, since at the heart of his vast motherland and his own little motherland, one he feels is very dear and close to him, one where his beloved walks in a flourishing garden, holding his wee son by the hand as he takes his own first baby steps in life. Society, our society, the society comprising our nation, is already today capable of seeing to it that a young mother, the wife of a Russian officer, need not worry about how to get food for her baby. She should be provided for, maybe not in the style that the oligarchs' wives are accustomed to, nor has she any use for the shallow fad of owning a supposedly expensive car. She will have far more than that: love and a future. Her main achievement is the restoration of her motherland. This is her principal work, her principal task in life, and society should pay her a salary equal to that of her husband. That's not much, of course, in return for her grand co-creation, but such a step will at least be an initial goodwill gesture on the part of society and the state. Such a possibility already exists right now. Only one shouldn't confuse things by bringing in higher-level economic considerations. Currently, the oil pipeline is showering Russia with rain of American dollars. And why is it not a single drop of this rain falling on any Russian officer, his wife or child, or his little motherland? Who thought up such arrangements, concealing themselves behind that supposed panacea for all ills? Democracy? Is it democratic when poorly paid soldiers or officers of the Russian army are obliged to defend wealthy oligarchs? Their fancy detached houses along the Rublisko highway, and their numerous counterparts in other regions of the country? That's not democracy. That's drivelocracy. And if such drivel doesn't change, we shan't have any defense or protection at all. There will be no protection for the average citizen, nor even for the president, let alone the petty and major oligarchs. The extermination of this drivel will spell an end to corruption, drug trafficking, and the notorious bribe-taking from drivers on the part of traffic cops. Now tell me, why should a copper have to stand in the street and breathe into his lungs all the roadway dust and the exhaust fumes of all the expensive and not so expensive cars passing by, as though they were the cat's pajamas and he were nothing but a nincompoop? He stands there watching out for their safety, for which he is paid a mere pittance. Indeed, if he didn't take bribes from these cars' owners, he would be ridiculed by his relatives, who would think it utterly abnormal. His wife would tear into him, and his children would turn away from a father who couldn't even afford to buy them a pair of last season's jeans. And he is not at all terrified of the police anti-corruption squads. So what if he's sacked from his job? That's no great loss. It's not a job that will guarantee a living for his family in return for honest labor. It simply means he has to look for another. But what kind of job? What kind of job can he find where he can maintain his integrity and still provide for his family? And so he stands there in the dust and exhaust fumes and takes his bribes. And for this, society hardly condemns him, but pays him. So what, we're all becoming like this, society thinks? Now that's terrifying. The fact that we're getting used to it. We see streaming about the other possible scenarios. We get used to seeing the crowds of prostitutes, homeless children, and street thugs. We get accustomed to the stage shows we call elections. Or is someone, in fact, accustoming us to these? After all, up until recently, the most terrifying thing for an inhabitant of a Russian village was a social disdain on the part of his fellow villagers. Observing, "She's a slut. He hasn't kept his property up." And so, it's time to bring back those days. The time will most certainly come when the most pleasant thing for a Russian citizen to hear will be society's approval in the form of, "He's a good man. He has sensitive and properly behaved children. He has a splendid domain." Then there won't be any more crime, corruption, or drug trafficking. It will surely come, that time. On a bench in a shady garden sits a graying elderly man, tenderly stroking the chestnut-colored hair of his 3-year-old granddaughter, her head nuzzled against his chest, while his 11-year-old grandson takes the general's great coat hanging on the back of the bench and tries it on. 2 large general stars adorn the epaulettes of the great coat, which once featured 2 small lieutenant stars. But that's not the most important thing, the gray-headed general thinks, looking at his grandchildren. The most important thing is that he created and saved for his grandchildren this garden, this pond, and this whole marvelous space in his kin's domain, his little motherland in the heart of Russia. He has saved Russia, and she is flourishing, his motherland. A fresh, cool breeze wafts the fragrance of her gardens around the whole world, and interplanetary winds announce the flourishing of the earth to other worlds, and the stars in the heavens burn with just a touch of envy and a dream of meeting visitors from the earth, the wise and bright sons and daughters of God. It will come to pass, but in the meantime, do you hear, lieutenants, how the heart of the Russian land is beating, sounding the alarm? How it is begging for you to take her little by little to yourself and plant gardens? She promises to return to each of you your spaces of paradise and give you the gift of eternity. Do you hear? You must hear. The termination of capital outflow and a new inflow of capital into Russia. The return of her intellectual resources. I can theoretically prove that this will happen with the adoption of Anastasia's program in full. This has also been shown theoretically by famous scholarly researchers as well as by students working on their graduating essays. There are arguments on both sides here. Only practice can offer incontrovertible proof, and that it has done. People of the Russian diaspora have been flocking from near and far to communities still under construction, communities which as yet do not have a solid legal footing. I know, for example, just in one community near the city of Vladimir, of a teacher from Turkmenistan and a young couple from America. A similar trend can be observed in many other communities now being built on the territory of Russia and Ukraine. People who can't wait for a law on land grants are buying up land, endeavoring to work within existing legislation. They are buying back their motherland. It is the duty of society and the state to refund their money. Otherwise, there will be a curse hanging over the head of anyone who has seen fit to take money from someone for starting to settle on the land where he was born. In any event, people are coming back, even if it is just 1 or 2 at a time for now. You can judge for yourselves what will happen under a favorable coincidence of circumstances, i.e., the adoption of a law granting every willing family a plot of land on which to set up a king's domain. Letter to the Russian President from Germany. Anastasia, Registered Society, Administrative Office, the President of the Russian Federation. Dear President of Russia, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, this is a letter from the former citizens of a country which no longer exists, the USSR. For various reasons, many of us find ourselves living abroad. Germany has become a refuge for more than 3 million former Soviet citizens. While flocking over the border and discovering the Western civilized paradise, many of us have recognized that at the same time we have lost our motherland, without which no one can ever be happy in the fullest sense. Today, in Russia, a brand new idea has made its appearance, guaranteeing man's physical and mental health, an idea already appealing to many people of various nationalities, including those living in Western Europe. Thanks to this idea, we realize that right now it is Russia that possesses the spiritual potential needed for the rebirth of harmonious man and the restoration of a harmonious state. Detailed information about this idea is available in the Ringing Cedars series by Vladimir Migre, which to date has sold almost 6 million copies overall. It is Migre's books that have given Russians living in the Commonwealth of Independent States and other countries a new and marvelous hope of rebirth, which is a vital need for every man, family, and state. The substance of the idea can be summed up as follows. Every family or citizen should have the right to receive, free of charge, 1 hectare of land on which to set up their little motherland, their family domain, which can be passed down by inheritance from generation to generation. Man was born on the land and should have his own specific piece of his motherland, created and cultivated with his own hands, and the hands of several generations of his family. In one of your speeches, you stated that Russia was born and long lived in the countryside, on the land, and that is its destined path. We agree. Having tasted the pleasures of Western civilization, we are acutely aware that drug trafficking, prostitution, the plight of homeless children, thievery, and murder are all the fruits of this same celebrated civilization. We are not even mentioning the most painful European problems, namely the environment and demographics. Russia, too, has been experiencing these same problems in trying to reinvent itself on the Western model. Today, it is becoming clear to many in the West that the path being followed by their democratic states is leading to a dead end, if not utter self-destruction. Russia has gone through difficult trials over the many centuries of its history, all of which have served to nurture a special spirit among its people. It is thanks to this spirit that, at the times of the most despairing spiritual and environmental crises, its citizens will be able to stand on the edge of the abyss and, in spite of everything, not only give birth to a new national idea, grow new life, but also head off the catastrophe of self-destruction which threatens all mankind. We, as former citizens of the USSR, are fully aware of what is meant by the simple concept of motherland. Whether we have taken out foreign citizenship or not, many of us have realized that our hearts and souls remain in the places we lived for most of our lives. We would like to return to Russia and start creating our family domains, establishing new style communities. The activity of setting up a family domain will lead to an improvement in the quality of life for the whole commonwealth of people. We realize that a lot depends on us, on our labors, our capabilities, our experience. Many of us have taken on new professions in Europe. We have studied foreign languages. Some of us have started our own businesses. There are quite a few of us who have begun studying the experience of Western eco-villages and non-traditional methods of farming. In our communities, we shall build our own schools, clubs, and hospitals. There may not be a need for special government subsidies, as our numbers include all sorts of experts, and we are prepared and able to seek out our own financing and opportunities. This kind of activity will lead to a fundamental improvement in the lives of the great commonwealth of people. Lands that have been unused, abandoned, or have lain waste up till now will become fruitful orchards, and on them will be born new generations of Russians with a new consciousness, with a new feeling for and outlook on the world. Moreover, we all desire to assist our relatives and family members now living in Russia or the Commonwealth of independent states. This will also help solve the problems faced by youth, the jobless, and the homeless. We are prepared right at this moment to muster the forces of several generations of our families and also put all our capabilities, experience, knowledge, and financial resources toward the goal of co-creating a proud, majestic, and mighty motherland of Russia. To implement this idea, we ask your consideration of the following questions. 1. Every willing family or individual citizen should be granted the right to receive, at no charge, 1 hectare of land for the lifetime use, with the right of inheritance, but with no right to sell, whereon to create a family domain. 2. Simplification of the procedures to obtain Russian citizenship on the part of those who wish to create their own little motherland and a vast Russia, who were born on the territory of the RSFSR, or of other erstwhile Soviet republics and who formerly held citizenship in the USSR. Faithfully and respectfully, future citizens of Russia, Germany, 160 signatures. This letter, unfortunately, met no reply at all from Russia. Not even a simple pro forma memo from some kind of office was received in response. The Russian-speaking community in Germany has in their possession a postal confirmation to the effect that the administration office of the Russian president indeed received the letter. You know, this lack of response is already becoming a pattern. It's not just you, but we who are living here in Russia too, we aren't getting any reply either. On the internet site of the Anastasia Foundation, there's a whole section full of letters, some of them written in English, including letters addressed to the President of Russia. For 5 years now, people have been writing on one and the same topic, Kin's domains. But to date, there has not been a single reply either to individually or collectively written letters. As you will soon realize, it couldn't be any other way, since here in Russia there are forces which have pegged themselves higher than the president or the government. They believe themselves to be higher than the people too, only I think this is an ill-founded belief. Of course, one can rise higher than a drunken people, but there is not and cannot be any power higher than a people in whose hearts lives not only a dream of the future, but a burning desire to put such a dream into practice. It behooves me to respond to you, dear former fellow citizens, on behalf of our government officials, on behalf of the President. First of all, I must thank you people, you who now live in Germany, America, Israel, Poland, and the Czech Republic, and Slovakia, Italy, and France, Georgia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, and even in Mongolia. It is thanks to your efforts that the books about Anastasia have been translated and published in the countries where you are currently residing. I didn't know you personally, and so was unable to ask you to do this, but there is something I do know. I know how your hearts have been touched and how you went about approaching publishers and translators. And when you did not find a reciprocal understanding, you set about translating and publishing my books yourselves. This happened, for example, in the Czech Republic, in Slovakia, Canada, and America. And finally, you found some understanding. I felt this for the first time in Germany when I addressed readers' conferences in Berlin and Stuttgart. Sitting together in the overflowing auditorium were Russian speakers who had immigrated to Germany from Russia and native German speakers who had no knowledge of Russian in roughly equal numbers. I knew the two groups didn't get along all that well, but here they were sitting side by side and good-naturedly trying to explain to one another the translation from Russian, which was, I'm sure, not always understandable. I used to consider Germans pedantic and not a strongly emotional people, but life has shown me otherwise. It was none other than a German farmer who, after reading about Anastasia, got into his car and drove all the way to Siberia. He went knowing neither the language nor the Russian road system, neither the Russian traffic police nor the weather. He got there. He returned home with Russian souvenirs for his friends. My great gratitude naturally goes out to all those who, at their own initiative, and sometimes at their own expense, have translated and published the books abroad. But the books, after all, are not the most important thing. Something else is. Thank you all for your understanding and support of the ideas and dream that have come out of the Siberian Russia. Now this dream is no longer a Russian dream. Now it is yours as well, and in equal measure. May you succeed in preserving it, putting it into practice, and passing on to be perfected by your children. It is hard to tell who has performed the most significant service, Anastasia with her impassioned sayings, the books themselves, or all those who have seized upon the idea and carried the torch forward. Anastasia has said, I give the whole of my soul to people. In people I shall prevail through my soul. Prepare yourself, all wickedness and evil-mindedness, to leave the earth. I thought these were just simple words. However, life has shown me that they are not simple at all. Anastasia's dream has been lit with tiny sparks in the hearts of millions of people scattered across the globe. People of many different nationalities and faiths. This dream is no longer just her dream. It belongs to many people and will not fade. It is now the dream of the ages and of eternity. Chapter 11. 1 hectare, a piece of planet Earth. I'm often told, why do you make such a fuss over 1 hectare? There are more important things. But in my view, there is nothing more important in our life right now than to return the earth to its original flourishing state. And that is why I keep talking about a hectare of family land. Behind it, after all, there is something immeasurably more significant. I don't always have the reasoning and intellectual capacity, nor perhaps the temperament, to explain this. But when there's even just a little breakthrough and people understand, well, I consider that a victory. One occasion in particular stands out. The year was 2003, Switzerland, Zurich. An international forum. I was invited by the organizers and allotted a time to speak. I began talking about an idea that saw its birth in Russia, but the audience didn't appear all that receptive. Then there was a question from the floor. How do you tie in this hectare of land with man's spiritual development? Perhaps the problem of land tillage is important enough for Russia, but these questions have long been resolved in Europe. We're here to talk about spirituality. A little nervous, I began my reply this way. I'm talking about a hectare of land and setting up one's family domain on it. And some people might think that it's rather a primitive notion. We have to talk about the great teachings on spirituality. They say, because that is the topic of this prestigious European forum. I know. I was told by the organizers that sitting before me in this auditorium are well-known innovative educators, philosophers, and writers on spirituality from all over Europe, along with other thinkers on this topic who are no less important. But it is precisely because I am mindful of the composition of this audience here before me that I am specifically talking about a hectare of land. Ladies and gentlemen, I am convinced that concepts such as love and spirituality must necessarily have a material embodiment. The hectare of land I have in mind, the hectare Anastasia speaks about, is much more than a mere hectare of land. It is a space through which you may be connected to the cosmos. All the planets of the universe will react to this space, and consequently to you. They will be your friends, assistants, and co-creators. In terms of the laws of nature, look what happens to an ordinary flower, a daisy, for example. The daisy is inseparably connected with the cosmos, the planets, and the sun. The flower opens its petals when the sun comes up and closes them when the sun goes down. They are at one with each other, in harmony and with each other. Not even trillions of kilometers or light years could break the connection. They are bonded together, the great sun and the little earthly flower. They know that only together can they be creators of a great universal harmony. But every single blade of grass on the earth reacts not only to the sun, it also reacts to other planets. It reacts to man, to the energy of his feelings. Scientists conducted an experiment in which sensors were attached to an ordinary flowering houseplant, and polygraph indicators registered even the minutest energy impulses coming from the flower. Several people were sent into the room in turn. One of them simply walked past the flower. A second went over and gave it some water, while a third went in and cut off one of the leaves. According to the data registered by the polygraph, whenever the person who tore off a leaf entered the room, the plant would get agitated and cause the indicator to jump. A related phenomenon can also be often noticed. Flowers fade when their owner goes away. The upshot is that all plants react to man. They may like a particular man, or they may not. Consequently, they may transmit to their planets a message of either love or absence of love. And now imagine that you have some kind of space, say a hectare of land. This isn't just any run-of-the-mill hectare of land where potatoes are grown for sale, but a hectare of land on which you have begun to create based on a particular level of consciousness or spirituality. You have your own territory on which there are a whole lot of plants cultivated not by hired workers but directly by you yourself. Every plant, every blade of grass will react to you with love, and these plants, as living beings, are capable of collecting for you all the best energies of the universe. They collect them and offer them to you. Plants feed on more than just the energy of the soil. After all, you are aware that there are some plants that can grow even without soil. 5,000 years ago in ancient Egypt, there lived priests who created a variety of religions, and these priests were in control of whole nations. These priests were the richest people in the world of that time. The basements of their palaces were filled with trunks of gold and precious gems. They were acquainted with a whole range of secret sciences. The pharaoh turned to them for advice and money. But each of these highly placed priests had his own hectare of land, on which he permitted no slaves to work. These were the richest people of their day, with a knowledge of a great many sciences. They knew the secrets of a hectare of land. On the walls of the ancient temples of Egypt, the priests' temples was inscribed the warning, "Do not accept food from a slave." This is example 1. Example 2. In ancient Rome, the senators issued a decree that if a slave was capable of working on the land and had been given land, then that slave could be sold to another master only if the land were sold with him, so as not to let any outsiders into contact with what was growing on that land. And why did the Roman senators give land to some of their slaves? And why did they give them money on top of that to build themselves a house? For one reason only, to obtain 10% of a harvest which had been cultivated and nurtured with love and care by the man growing it. It was only produce like this that could be at all beneficial. The Egyptian priests and the senators of ancient Rome knew what kind of food was beneficial to man. The produce we eat today is in no way fit for human consumption. It's dead produce. There's a vast difference between berries one picks from a bush to eat on the spot and berries sold in a supermarket. It's not just that they've already started to decay, but there's no energy left in them. They're incapable of feeding man's soul. And I'm not even mentioning the mutant plants created by our technological world. So, if you don't have your own hectare of land, there's nowhere that you're going to find food worthy of human consumption. You can take a little money and buy some sort of vegetables, but you must realize that those vegetables were not grown for you. They weren't grown for any man at all. They were grown for money. There is not a disease which cannot be cured by the space of love, a space you have created with your own hands and your own soul. People are the children of God, the world of animals and plants, the air and the space around us. These are also God's creations, and everything taken together is nothing less than the materially embodied Spirit of God. If someone calls himself a highly spiritual person, let him show the material embodiment of his spirituality. Imagine God looking down on you from right above right now, and he sees someone driving a tram, another one of his children constructing buildings, another standing in a store and selling things from behind a counter. These aren't the professions God created. They are professions for slaves. God didn't want his children to be slaves, and he created a marvelous world and gave it in stewardship to his children. Take care of it and use it. But to do that, you must understand this world, understand what the moon is, what the herb known as yarrow is. And what is a hectare of land? Is it a place where man must work by the sweat of his brow? No, it is a place where man shouldn't work at all. It is a place through which man ought to control the world. Tell me, who gives greater pleasure to God? A man driving a tram, or a man who might have only a small piece of land but has transformed it into a paradise? The latter, of course. Can people today open up a road to the cosmos? Or can they be taught how to settle the moon or Mars? Of course not, because they will put weapons and pollution there, and end up having the same wars there as on Earth. Yet man, after all, has been created to populate other worlds, and this will come about only when man understands and beautifies his own Earth. The way to settle the planets of the universe isn't technical at all. It is psychotelepathic. Man needs to become consciously aware of what constitutes the true beauty of the universe. Your city of Zurich is considered beautiful. We can say 1,000 times how beautiful it is, but what specifically is beautiful about it? Yes, it is very clean here. Yes, it looks as though there are many well-to-do people living here. But is the land covered with asphalt truly beautiful? Is it really good to have little green islands popping up just in certain places? Is it good that there is a dying tree, a majestic cedar, right in the center of your city? It is suffocating from the smog. It is suffocating from the exhaust fumes. And it's not the only thing that's dying and suffocating. The people walking along the city streets are suffocating from these fumes too. We should give some thought to all that we have managed to contrive on this earth. And it's best to talk about it in very simple terms. Let each one of us take a small plot of his land, put his whole mind and his whole spirituality together and create a very small but concrete paradise. He will transform his little piece of land on our large planet into a flourishing garden, giving a material embodiment to his spirituality, following God's example. If millions of people do this in a whole lot of countries, then the whole earth will become a flourishing garden, and there won't be any wars because millions of people will be completely engaged in a grand co-creation. And if Russians should then descend upon Switzerland or Germany, it will only be to delight in the contemplation of beautiful living oases, to learn from their experience in embodying true spirituality. Russia, unfortunately, is currently trying with all its might to be like the West. Russia's politicians are peppering their speeches with references to Western countries as developed or civilized. They are urging the people to catch up to them in development and being civilized. Our politicians still don't know that we have the opportunity not only to catch up quickly but to significantly overtake them. But this can come to pass only if Russia does a complete about-face and starts heading in the opposite direction. This is in no way to suggest I am trying to denigrate or insult your Western civilization. But we're talking here, after all, about spirituality, and we need to be honest and sincere in what we say to one another. Spirituality can be measured simply by material wealth and technological achievements. Such a one-sided technocratic approach to mankind's development will invariably lead to an abyss. No doubt those of you gathered here today will admit this. But then you must also admit that you are running out in front, with us right behind you. Try to stop and figure out what's happened to our world. If you do manage to figure it out, call out to those running behind you. Hey, you'd better stop, chaps. Stop running. There's an abyss ahead, and we're already on the edge of it. Find another way. If we really listen to our hearts together, we ought to go from simply talking about spirituality to its material embodiment. 1 hectare is but a tiny dot on the face of our planet Earth, but millions of these dots will transform the whole planet into a flourishing garden. Trillions of flower petals, along with the happy smiles of children and oldsters, will tell the universe that the people of the earth are ready for a grand co-creation. And the planets of the universe will respond. We are waiting for you, man. We're waiting for you, you worthy Son of God. Our millennium has ushered in a great transformation on the earth. Tens of thousands of Russian families have already aspired to obtain their own hectare of land. A father and mother who are actually creating a space of love for their children are more spiritual than the most celebrated wise men who only talk about spirituality. Let the spirit of each man spring up from the ground as a beautiful flower, a tree with fragrant fruit, and let this take place on every single hectare of our planet. After these words, for some time absolute silence reigned in the hall. This was followed by thunderous applause. I spoke in Zurich on the following day, too, once again to a full house. A number of our former compatriots were present here, too. I don't think I came across too coherently, especially since I was speaking through an interpreter. But people stayed, they listened, because it wasn't just me that was talking with this audience. A higher power was speaking, a very simple, specific, yet at the same time extraordinary power, one that has been preserved for millennium in the depths of the human soul, a nostalgia for the true way of life for man as creator. And then I thought, do I really need to explain to anyone that all Russia's sons and daughters that have been blown away by an ill wind will most definitely return? Of course they'll come back. You will remember Anastasia's words. Mother Russia will greet crowds of guests on that day. They are all of the earth as Atlanteans born. As prodigal sons they shall return. Let all the bards everywhere play on their guitars, and the old shall write letters to their children, and children to their parents. Both you and I shall become very young, and people will feel young for the very first time.